Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something pretty fascinating, well, to me at least. It's all about cognitive biases. Those little mental quirks that kind of trip us up sometimes and lead us to make, you know, not the best decisions.
Yeah, exactly. Those like inherent tendencies that we all have, they can really skew our judgment sometimes without us even realizing it. It's like having these hidden patterns in our thinking that can really mess with our perception of reality.
So we're talking about those mental shortcuts our brains take, the ones that are supposed to make thinking faster, efficient, but sometimes they backfire. Big time.
Totally. And you know what's fascinating? These aren't just random brain farts. There are actual systematic patterns, like predictable ways these biases work. And that's what makes them so interesting to study and try to, understand.
Right. So we're not just randomly making bad decisions. These biases are kind of like pushing us in certain directions without us even realizing it.
Yeah. And getting a handle on them. I mean, that's the whole point of this deep dive, right? So we can
Yeah.
start recognizing these biases in ourselves and make, more conscious and deliberate choices.
Exactly. And to do that, we're turning to a really interesting book, How to Think Clearly, A Guide to Human Cognitive Biases by Chen Chiangkai. It's really packed with insights on how these biases affect everything, from our personal decisions to how we interact with the world around us.
Oh, yeah. Chen Chiangkai really breaks it down in a super clear and engaging way. He dives into all sorts of fascinating biases, from those affecting our decision-making to social biases, memory biases, you name it.
All right, so let's jump right in. The book kicks off with a whole section on decision-making biases, and the first one, confirmation bias. This one feels like it's everywhere these days.
Oh, confirmation bias, it's definitely a big one and super relevant in today's world. Basically, it's that tendency we have to seek out and favor information that just confirms what we already believe, even if it might not be totally accurate or the whole picture.
It's like our brains are cherry-picking the evidence to support our existing opinions. It's kind of like that saying, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah. It's like we're building these echo chambers around ourselves. We surround ourselves with people and news sources that just reinforce what we already think.
So we end up in these little bubbles where our beliefs just keep getting stronger, even if they're not really based on solid ground.
And the scary part is, this isn't always a conscious choice. Our brains are kind of wired for cognitive consistency. It feels uncomfortable to encounter information that contradicts our beliefs.
Right. So it's easier to just stick with what we know, even if it might be wrong.
And it's not just about opinions or beliefs. Confirmation bias can also lead to some really serious problems, like reinforcing stereotypes and prejudice.
Yeah, the book talks about how if we have a pre-existing stereotype about a group of people, we might only focus on the information or the examples that confirm that stereotype and ignore all the evidence that contradicts it.
Exactly. It's like we're actively looking for reasons to justify our prejudices rather than being open to seeing people as individuals.
So confirmation bias can really have a huge impact on how we see the world and interact with others. All right, moving on to another big decision-making bias that the book dives into, anchoring bias.
Oh, yeah, anchoring bias. This one is really sneaky. It's this tendency we have to rely too heavily on the first piece of information we get, like the first price we see or the first opinion we hear.
And it becomes this mental anchor that we use to judge everything else, even if that initial piece of information isn't actually accurate or relevant.
Exactly. It's like getting stuck on that first number or that first impression, and it kind of distorts everything else we see afterward.
The book gives a great example of this with product pricing. Like if you see a high-end version of a product first, let's say a really expensive TV, for example, even the lower price models might seem way more expensive than they actually are.
Yeah, that initial price sets the bar. It becomes your reference point. And even if the other TVs are objectively a good value, you might still feel like you're spending too much because you're still anchored to that initial high price.
So marketers and salespeople can really take advantage of this bias, can't they? Like putting a really expensive item next to a slightly less expensive one to make it seem like a bargain.
Totally. It's all about framing. The book talks about how even the way information is presented can create these anchors in our minds, making us more likely to make certain choices.
Okay, so what's going on in our brains when this anchoring bias kicks in? The book mentions a connection to other biases, like confirmation bias.
Yeah, so once we have that anchor in place, we might start selectively seeking out information that supports our decision, even if it's not the most rational choice. We want to feel good about our choices.
So we're not only anchored to that initial information, we're also actively looking for reasons to justify sticking with it.
Exactly. And there's also a link to self-serving bias, which is our tendency to take credit for successes but blame external factors for failures.
So with anchoring, we might be more likely to latch onto an anchor that makes us feel good about ourselves, even if it's not the best choice objectively.
Right. We want to protect our egos and avoid admitting we made a mistake.
Okay, so how can we break free from these anchoring traps? The book suggests some mitigation strategies, like seeking out diverse perspectives.
Yeah, that's a big one. If you're making an important decision, it's crucial to get input from people who might have different viewpoints, different experiences. Don't just stay in your own echo chamber.
It's like getting a second opinion, but for your thinking process.
Exactly. And the book also emphasizes the importance of education and training on these biases. The more we understand how they work, the better equipped we are to recognize them and make more conscious choices.
Okay, makes sense. All right, let's move on to another fascinating decision-making bias, the availability bias.
Oh, this one's super interesting and very relevant to our current information overload world, right? It's basically our tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events that are, easily recalled or vivid in our minds, like things we see a lot in the news or on social media.
So if we constantly hear about plane crashes, for example, we might start to believe that flying is super dangerous, even though statistically it's actually much safer than driving.
Exactly. The vividness of those images, the emotional impact, it makes them stick in our minds.
Yeah.
So we overestimate the likelihood of them happening.
And it's not just the news, right? Our personal experiences also contribute to this bias.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like if you've had a string of bad luck lately, you might start to feel like everything is going wrong, even though it's just a temporary blip.
Or on the flip side, if you've been super successful recently, you might get overconfident and think you can't fail.
That's right. Our brains tend to focus on what's readily available, what's easy to recall, and that can really skew our judgment.
The book also mentions how the availability bias can influence our perception of risk more broadly. Like if we see a lot of news about violent crime, we might start to feel like we're in more danger than we actually are.
Yeah, the media plays a huge role in shaping our perception of the world, and they tend to focus on the sensational, the dramatic, the things that grab our attention.
So we end up with a skewed view of reality. We think certain things are more common or more dangerous than they really are.
And that can lead to all sorts of problems,
Right.
like making irrational decisions based on fear or anxiety.
So how can we fight back against this availability bias? The book offers some helpful strategies, right?
Absolutely. One of the most important things is to encourage critical thinking. Don't just blindly accept everything you see or hear. Question the source, consider the context, look for evidence.
So be a savvy consumer of information.
Exactly. And the book also suggests using more systematic decision-making processes, like weighing the pros and cons or doing a cost-benefit analysis. Don't just go with your gut feeling.
Okay, let's move on to another fascinating bias that Chen Kai discusses. The framing effect.
Oh, the framing effect. This one is all about how the way information is presented to us can drastically affect our choices, even if the underlying facts are the same.
Right, it's like how you spin the story. The same information can be presented in a positive or negative light, and that can completely change our perception.
The book gives a great example with investment choices. Imagine you're presented with two options. One has a 20% chance of success, and the other has an 80% chance of failure.
Well, logically, they're the same thing, right? But the way they're framed makes a huge difference.
Totally. Most people would be way more drawn to the option framed as a 20% chance of success, even though it's equally likely to fail. We tend to be loss-averse. We hate losing more than we love winning.
So we're naturally drawn to the option that focuses on the potential gains.
Exactly. And this framing effect isn't limited to just financial decisions. It pops up everywhere. In marketing, in politics, even in our personal relationships.
The book talks about how advertisers use framing all the time, right? Like focusing on the benefits you'll gain by using their product rather than the potential drawbacks of not using it.
Yeah, it's all about highlighting the positives and downplaying the negatives. And political campaigns do this too, framing their candidates and their policies in the most favorable light possible.
So what can we do to avoid being swayed by these framing tactics?
Awareness is key. Just knowing about the framing effect can help us be more critical of the information we're given. And the book emphasizes the importance of seeking out different perspectives.
So don't just accept the first frame you're given. Look for alternative ways of presenting the same information.
Exactly. Try to see the issue from multiple angles. And be wary of emotionally charged language or overly dramatic presentations. They're often designed to trigger our biases.
All right, let's delve into another interesting decision-making bias. The outcome bias. This one seems like it could lead to some unfair judgments.
It definitely can. Outcome bias is this tendency we have to judge the quality of a decision based on what happened afterward, based on the results rather than on the process or the logic behind the decision itself.
So it's like we're judging the decision maker based on whether they got lucky or not, rather than on the actual decision itself.
Yeah, it's like saying, well, they won, so they must have made a good decision, even if it was a risky gamble that just happened to pay off. Or conversely, they lost, so they must have been incompetent, even if they followed all the right steps and just got unlucky.
The book gives an example with stock market investments. Like if someone makes a risky investment that turns out to be successful, they're hailed as a genius. But if the same investment goes sour, they're labeled as reckless.
Exactly. And it's the same thing in other areas, too, like medicine. A doctor might make the best possible decision based on the available information, but if the patient has a negative outcome, they're suddenly seen as incompetent.
So this outcome bias can make people overly risk-averse, can't it? Because they're so afraid of being judged negatively if things don't turn out perfectly.
Absolutely. It can stifle innovation and prevent people from taking calculated risks that might actually be beneficial in the long run.
And it can also lead to a lot of unfair blame and criticism, especially in hindsight.
Yeah, when we know the outcome, it's easy to second-guess the decisions that were made. But we need to remember that the decision maker didn't have that luxury. They had to make the best choice they could with the information they had at the time.
Right. So it's important to be mindful of this outcome bias and try to judge decisions based on the process, not just the results.
Exactly. Look at the logic, the reasoning, the information that was available at the time. Don't just focus on whether things turned out good or bad.
Okay, let's move on to a bias that I think many of us can relate to. The sunk cost fallacy.
Oh, the sunk cost fallacy. This one is a classic. It's that tendency we have to stick with something, to keep investing in it, even when it's clearly not working anymore.
Like pouring money into a failing business or staying in a relationship that's making us unhappy. We feel like we've already invested so much that we can't give up now.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to justify our past investments, even if it means throwing good money after bad.
The book talks about how this is linked to cognitive dissonance, right? That uncomfortable feeling we get when our actions don't align with our beliefs or values.
Exactly. It's like our brains are trying to protect our egos. We don't want to admit we made a mistake. So we keep clinging to the hope that things will turn around.
And the longer we hold on, the harder it becomes to let go.
Right. The sunk costs become this psychological anchor that keeps us stuck in a bad situation.
So how can we break free from this sunk cost trap?
One of the most important things is to focus on the future, not the past. Ask yourself, what are the costs and benefits of continuing down this path? Don't dwell on what you've already lost.
So it's about cutting your losses and moving on, even if it's painful.
Exactly. And the book also suggests seeking out external perspectives. Talk to people who aren't emotionally invested in this situation. They can often provide a more objective viewpoint.
It's like getting a reality check from someone who can see things more clearly.
Exactly. And another helpful strategy is to set clear exit criteria in advance. Like if you're starting a business, decide beforehand what metrics you'll use to determine if it's time to cut your losses.
Okay, now let's talk about overconfidence bias. This one seems pretty self-explanatory, but it can have some serious consequences.
Overconfidence bias. Yeah, it's basically thinking we're better than we actually are, overestimating our abilities and knowledge.
So we're all prone to a little bit of self-delusion.
To some extent, yeah. A little bit of confidence can be good, of course. It can help us take risks and pursue our goals. But when it tips over into overconfidence, it can lead to some serious problems.
Like making reckless decisions or failing to adequately prepare for challenges. Totally. And the book talks about how overconfidence can make us less receptive to feedback and more likely to dismiss other people's opinions.
So we become closed off to learning and growing.
Right. We think we already have all the answers.
And the book also connects this to optimistic bias, which is that belief that bad things are less likely to happen to us than to other people.
Yeah, like we have this illusion of invulnerability.
So we underestimate risks and overestimate our chances of success.
And this can be especially dangerous in areas like investing or entrepreneurship.
Okay, so how can we keep our overconfidence in check?
One of the most effective strategies is to actively seek out feedback, especially from people who will be honest with us, even if it's not what we want to hear.
So don't just surround yourself with yes men.
Exactly. And the book also suggests looking at our past track record. Have we actually been as successful as we think we are? Have we made similar mistakes before?
So it's about being realistic about our own strengths and weaknesses. Right. And another helpful technique is to practice what's called devil's advocacy, where you deliberately try to find flaws in your own ideas or plans.
So play the role of your own worst critic.
Exactly. And finally, the book emphasizes the importance of embracing humility. Recognize that we all make mistakes, that we all have blind spots, and that we can always learn and improve.
The book also briefly mentions the gambler's fallacy as another decision-making bias. What's that one about?
Oh, the gambler's fallacy. That's the mistaken belief that past events can influence the outcome of random events. Like if you're flipping a coin and you get heads 5 times in a row, you might think that tails is due to come up next, even though each flip is independent.
So it's like thinking that the universe is keeping track of these random events and trying to even things out.
Yeah, but that's not how randomness works. Each event is independent of the previous ones.
All right, let's shift gears now and talk about social biases. These are the biases that affect how we perceive and interact with other people.
Yeah, social biases, they can really shape our relationships and our view of the world around us. And the first one the book covers is the halo effect.
The halo effect, that sounds kind of positive.
It can be, in a way.
Yeah.
Basically, the halo effect is this tendency we have to let our overall impression of a person influence how we judge their specific traits or behaviors.
So if we think someone is generally good or likable, we tend to see all of their actions in a positive light.
Exactly. Like if we meet someone who's attractive and charismatic, we might automatically assume they're also intelligent, kind, and trustworthy, even if we have no evidence to support those assumptions.
It's like that old saying, first impressions matter.
Yeah, they really do. And the halo effect can have a big impact in areas like performance evaluations, hiring decisions, even in our personal relationships.
The book talks about how someone with a good reputation might get away with mistakes that someone else would be harshly punished for.
Totally. And conversely, someone who makes a bad first impression might struggle to overcome that negative perception,
Even if they later prove to be competent and trustworthy.
So we need to be aware of this halo effect and try to judge people based on their individual actions and qualities, not just our overall impression of them.
Exactly. Don't let those initial judgments cloud your judgment.
Okay, let's talk about another social bias that can have some really negative consequences. Stereotyping.
Stereotyping is essentially making generalizations about entire groups of people based on their race, gender, religion, or any other group affiliation.
So it's like putting people into boxes based on very limited information.
Yeah, and those boxes are often filled with inaccurate and harmful assumptions. Stereotypes can lead to prejudice, discrimination, and all sorts of social injustices.
The book gives some really clear examples, like assuming that all women are emotional or that all men are aggressive. Right. Or assuming that people of certain races are more likely to be criminals or less intelligent. These stereotypes are deeply ingrained in our culture, and they can have a huge impact on how we treat each other.
So it's crucial to be aware of these stereotypes and challenge them whenever we encounter them.
Absolutely. We need to recognize that people are individuals, not just representatives of their group.
Okay, let's move on to in-group bias, which is our tendency to favor the groups that we belong to over other groups.
In-group bias is all about that feeling of us versus them. We naturally gravitate towards people who are similar to us, who share our values, beliefs, or interests.
And we tend to see our own group as being better or more deserving than other groups.
Exactly. It's like tribalism. We want to belong to a group, and we want our group to succeed.
And this bias can have a big impact on how we make decisions, right?
Yeah, the book talks about how in-group bias can lead to favoritism in hiring or promotions, even if the out-group candidate is more qualified.
So it can create unfairness and inequality.
And it can also reduce cooperation and trust between groups.
So it's important to recognize this bias and try to be fair and objective in our interactions with people from other groups.
Absolutely. We need to see everyone as individuals, not just as members of a group.
Okay, let's delve into attribution bias, which is how we explain the causes of behavior, both our own and others.
Attribution bias is all about the stories we tell ourselves about why people do the things they do. And those stories are often influenced by our own biases.
So we might come up with different explanations for the same behavior depending on who's doing it.
Exactly. The book gives some interesting examples, like if we succeed at something, we might attribute it to our own hard work and intelligence. But if we fail, we might blame external factors like bad luck or unfair circumstances.
It's like we're giving ourselves the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, and we're often less generous with others. If someone else succeeds, we might attribute it to luck or external factors. But if they fail, we might see it as a sign of their incompetence or bad character.
So this attribution bias can lead to a lot of misunderstandings and unfair judgments.
It can also affect our self-esteem and our motivation. If we constantly attribute our failures to our own shortcomings, we might start to feel helpless and give up.
So what's the key to making fairer and more accurate attributions?
One important strategy is to consider both internal and external factors. Don't just jump to conclusions about someone's character or personality. Think about the situation they were in, the challenges they were facing.
To be more understanding and empathetic.
Exactly. And the book also suggests trying to be more objective in our self-assessments. Be honest with ourselves about our strengths and weaknesses.
Okay, let's move on to conformity bias, which is our tendency to go along with the crowd, even if we don't agree.
Conformity bias is all about that pressure to fit in, to be like everyone else. We have this deep-seated desire to be accepted and to avoid standing out from the group.
So we might change our behavior or our opinions to match those of the people around us.
Even if it means going against our own better judgment.
The book talks about how this conformity bias can lead to groupthink, where everyone in a group starts to think alike and critical thinking goes out the window.
It can also lead to the perpetuation of harmful social norms, like sexism or racism, because people are afraid to speak out against the status quo.
So it's important to be aware of this conformity pressure and to have the courage to stand up for what we believe in, even if it means going against the grain.
Exactly. Don't be afraid to be the lone voice of dissent.
The book also briefly mentions outgroup homogeneity bias and the bandwagon effect. What are those about?
Outgroup homogeneity bias is the tendency to see members of other groups as being more similar to each other than they actually are. We tend to stereotype people who are different from us.
So it's like we're lumping them all together into one big category.
And the bandwagon effect is the tendency to do something just because everyone else is doing it. We're social creatures, and we're influenced by the behavior of others.
So we might buy a certain product or support a certain cause just because it's popular?
Even if we wouldn't have done it on our own.
Okay, let's switch gears now and talk about memory biases. These are the biases that affect how we remember the past.
Memory biases can be really fascinating because they show how unreliable our memories can be.
Oh.
We tend to think of our memories as accurate recordings of the past, but they're actually quite malleable.
So our memories are more like reconstructions than recordings.
Exactly. And the first memory bias the book touches on is the misinformation effect.
The misinformation effect? That sounds intriguing.
It basically means that information we're exposed to after an event can actually change our memory of that event.
So our memories can be contaminated by outside information.
Exactly. And this can have huge implications, especially in areas like eyewitness testimony.
Like if a witness is asked leading questions, it can actually alter their memory of what they saw.
Right. The questions themselves can plant suggestions in the witness's mind, leading them to remember things that didn't actually happen.
So it's crucial to be very careful about how we question witnesses and to avoid leading them.
Absolutely. And the book also talks about suggestibility, which is our general tendency to incorporate misleading information into our memories.
So we're not just susceptible to leading questions. We can also be influenced by suggestions from other people, from the media, even from our own imaginations.
Right. Our memories are constantly being shaped and reshaped by the information we encounter.
And this can lead to the formation of false memories, where we vividly remember something that never actually happened.
It's a fascinating and somewhat disturbing phenomenon.
Okay, let's move on to hindsight bias, which is that tendency to think that we knew it all along after something has happened.
Oh, hindsight bias, also known as the I knew it all along phenomenon. It's this feeling we get after an event that the outcome was predictable, even though it might not have been at the time.
Like if your favorite team wins a game, you might say, I knew they were going to win, even though you were probably just as nervous as everyone else during the game.
Exactly. It's easy to look back and see the signs, the patterns, the clues that led to the outcome. But we often overlook all the other possibilities that existed before the event happened.
So our memories are biased towards making the past seem more predictable than it actually was.
And this can have some negative consequences. It can make us overconfident in our ability to predict future events.
And it can also lead to blaming others for things they couldn't have foreseen.
Yeah, it's easy to say they should have known better when we have the benefit of hindsight. But that's not fair or accurate.
So how can we avoid falling into this hindsight bias trap?
One strategy is to try to remember how uncertain we actually felt before the event. Remind ourselves of all the other possible outcomes that we were considering.
So it's about being more humble and acknowledging that we don't always have all the answers.
Another helpful technique is to document our predictions beforehand. Write down what you think is going to happen and then compare that to what actually happens.
That's a great way to see how accurate our predictions really are.
Okay, let's talk about rosy retrospection, which is our tendency to remember the past more positively than it actually was.
Rosy retrospection. That sounds like a nice bias to have.
It can be. In some ways, it's like putting on rose-colored glasses and seeing the past through a nostalgic lens. We tend to remember the good times and downplay the bad times.
So our memories are like a highlight reel of the past.
Exactly. And this can be beneficial in some ways. It can help us maintain a positive outlook on life and appreciate the good experiences we've had.
But it can also be misleading.
Right. If we only focus on the positive aspects of the past, we might set unrealistic expectations for the future. We might also fail to learn from our mistakes.
So it's important to have a balanced view of the past, acknowledging both the good and the bad.
Exactly. And the book suggests keeping records of our experiences, like journals or photos, to help us remember things more accurately.
Okay, let's move on to source amnesia, which is our tendency to forget where we learned something.
Source amnesia can be a real problem, especially in this age of information overload. We're constantly bombarded with information from all sorts of sources, and it's easy to lose track of where we learned something.
So we might repeat a piece of information without knowing if it's actually true or reliable.
Right. And this can contribute to the spread of misinformation and fake news.
It can also lead to plagiarism, even if it's unintentional.
Exactly. We might think we came up with an idea ourselves when we actually read it somewhere else.
So what can we do to improve our source memory?
One strategy is to pay attention to where we're getting our information. Be more mindful of the sources we're using.
So don't just passively consume information. Be actively engaged with it.
And the book also suggests taking notes and citing our sources. This can help us keep track of where we learned things and avoid accidentally plagiarizing others.
Okay, the book also briefly mentions cryptomnesia and false memories as other types of memory biases.
Cryptomnesia is when we think we've come up with an original idea, but it's actually a memory from something we've seen or heard before.
So it's like unconscious plagiarism.
Exactly. And false memories are memories of things that never actually happened.
These can be quite vivid and convincing, even though they're completely made up.
And they can be influenced by suggestions from others, by our own imaginations, or even by our desires and expectations.
Okay, let's move on to frequency biases.
Yeah.
These are biases that affect our perception of how often things happen.
Frequency biases can really skew our view of the world, making us think that certain things are more common or less common than they actually are.
And the first one the book discusses is the frequency illusion, also known as the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon.
The frequency illusion is this weird feeling we get when we learn about something new and then suddenly we start seeing it everywhere.
Like if you learn a new word and then you start hearing it in conversations and seeing it in articles.
Exactly. It feels like the universe is conspiring to show you this thing over and over again.
But it's actually just a trick of our attention.
Once we become aware of something, we're more likely to notice it.
So it's not that the thing itself is more common, it's just that we're more attuned to it.
And this can lead us to overestimate how common it actually is.
Okay, let's talk about selective attention, which is our ability to focus on certain things while filtering out others.
Selective attention is crucial for our survival. We can't possibly pay attention to everything that's going on around us all the time.
So our brains have to choose what to focus on.
And that choice is often influenced by our goals, our expectations, and our past experiences.
So we might miss important information if it doesn't fit into our current framework.
Exactly. And the book talks about how selective attention can contribute to confirmation bias. We tend to pay attention to information that confirms our existing beliefs and ignore information that contradicts them.
So we're selectively filtering our reality to fit our worldview.
And this can be a dangerous thing.
Okay, let's move on to illusory correlation, which is our tendency to see patterns where none exist.
Illusory correlation is all about those false connections we make between things. Like, if we believe that a certain food gives us bad luck, we might start to notice every time we eat that food and something bad happens.
But we might be ignoring all the times we eat that food and nothing bad happens.
Exactly. Our brains are pattern-seeking machines. We're constantly looking for connections and explanations.
And sometimes we see patterns that aren't really there.
And this can lead to all sorts of superstitions and irrational beliefs.
Okay, let's talk about priming, which is how our exposure to one stimulus can affect our response to another stimulus.
Priming is a really fascinating phenomenon. It shows how subtle cues can influence our thoughts and behaviors without us even realizing it.
The book gives an example where people who were exposed to words related to old age walked more slowly afterwards.
Yeah, it's like those words activated a certain schema in their minds, and that influenced their behavior.
So we're constantly being primed by the world around us.
And those primes can affect everything from our purchasing decisions to our social interactions.
Okay, let's move on to the contrast effect, which is how our perception of something can be influenced by what we've just seen or experienced.
The contrast effect is all about relative comparisons.
Yeah.
Like if you lift a heavy weight and then lift a lighter weight, the lighter weight will feel even lighter than it actually is.
So our perception is influenced by the context.